Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the way one particular government department, DEFRA, is being described as dysfunctional as a direct consequence of the huge Brexit workload that it has and short-lived ministers running policy and no new staff to cope with the workload. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, there was a debate yesterday as a result of a public petition into whether there should be a public inquiry into the impacts of Brexit. There's not going to be one anytime soon, but I will be referencing that debate in the second video today, assuming there isn't any breaking news. So if the government can stop melting down for a few hours, I'll talk more about that then. But in this one, see, there are reports of less than happy days at DEFRA. This is the government department dealing with like farming and the environment and so on. You know, ever since they came to power, the Conservatives have been attempting to operate a slimmed down civil service. The justification was part balancing the books and part eliminating waste, as it often is. In the event, both justifications were wrong. Civil servants weren't sat around with their feet up, so removing them meant work that they were doing not being done. That meant public services not being delivered. We can see the result of that in the shattered nature of our public services. It hasn't happened suddenly, hasn't happened because of COVID. You know, it's happened because of 13 years of removing the people who provided those public services and making the rest of them work as inefficiently as possible. Nothing works in this country, nothing. Yesterday, Sunday now, the government carried out a test of an emergency alert system. They then put out a survey asking people if they'd heard the alert at 3 p.m, which is when it was supposed to go out, afterwards, or if they don't remember. There was no option for the many people who had their alert early or those who hadn't received it at all. They can't even get a simple survey right. The problems for the civil service became more pronounced with Brexit. Despite claims that Brexit would reduce red tape, it has massively increased it. Anyone who had any basic understanding of the EU knew this would happen, because the fact of the matter is the EU exists to reduce the bureaucratic load for people. That's what it does. At every level, red tape has increased since Brexit. It's increased for businesses wanting to export to or import from the EU. It's increased just for ordinary people who want to leave the country for holiday. The Daily Telegraph are whining about it now. All this red tape when we want to leave the country. You used to just have to show your passport. There, I've got a passport. Good show. Off you go. Now you need to have it checked. Well, hang on. How long have you spent in the EU in this 180-day period? Are you allowed in? And then you've got to have it stamped so that the next person can check to make sure you haven't stayed too long. And the government have got extra workload as well. The Tories increased civil servant staffing levels a little bit during the Brexit negotiation process, but they've then attempted to keep reducing it since, arguing, well, Brexit's now done, we don't need them. Only the numbers haven't been going down because Brexit isn't done. In fact, with our exit from the single market and customs union in particular, the workload has actually increased for all government departments, but one department in particular is really feeling the strain, and that is DEFRA. As you can imagine, this department has a huge role to play in our post-Brexit future. The fishing and farming industries have had their entire business model kicked about. Environmental regulations all need redoing. You know, this is the department which needs to be involved in the SPS standards checks needed to move certain goods between Britain and the EU. And this is just the necessary work which comes with an extreme Tory Brexit. This is just what they have to do if we're going to remain outside the single market and customs union. But because the Tories have got absolutely no idea how to manage a piss up in a brewery, much less a country, they are also piling lots of unnecessary extra work onto the department, for which there is no benefit to anyone. Just as with other government departments, DEFRA has had a series of ministerial changes as a consequence of running through 3 different prime ministers in the space of a couple of months. This meant that policy aims were stopped, changed, started again several times. It's not even like getting new secretaries of state, which has been the extent of the problem. There have been huge shifts in policy from pro-environmental to burn the entire planet to squeeze a bit more profit. So it hasn't just been a case of pause the work doing, see what the new minister wants to do, see if they want to tweak things a bit and then carry on. It's been rip everything up and start again from scratch. All of that work for which we paid money, for which civil servants worked hard, all thrown in the bin because a new Secretary of State says, no, we're doing it completely the opposite way now. You know, they've also have a particularly heavy workload related to the retained EU law bill. Now, this is the bill which is like, will they, won't they? You know, it aims to abolish thousands of rules and regulations overnight, but without any proper audit of which ones will be affected and which ones, you know, it will be a benefit to lose. It did look a few weeks ago that Sunak was kicking this one into the long grass, but now it's back again. I really don't know what's going on with it. But each government department, while it is ongoing, has to try and compile a list of the rules and regulations and so on covered by their department, which will be affected. This is a Herculean task. There are thousands of them. It's not that easy to know which are and which are not. And DEFRA is also going to need to make sure that we're ready to start on our own standards controls on EU imports later this year as well. So they've just this year had a load of extra work. I mean, the standards controls have already been delayed for years. Nobody seriously believes that we're ready to go now. All this extra work, and the department has not been given extra staff or funding to do it. Now ask yourselves this. So imagine your own workplace. So most of you work in a workplace that's got a particular, maybe it's a large workplace, it's got its own department. So imagine that in your department, suddenly your workload was trebled, but you were given no new staff or funding. What happens? Well, you can't do it all. It's that simple. You can't suddenly treble your productivity out of nothing. So you will need to tell your manager, you're going to have to give me a strict priority list because you've given me 3 times as much as I can do. So you tell me what's most important, because there's a load of stuff not going to get done. It's really that simple. Now imagine that priority list keeps changing. Well, now that's even less being done because you'll be wasting resources starting something, then being told to abandon it before completion, before starting on something else. So you will get even less done than you did when the amount of work needed was matched by resourcing. And DEFRA will be no different. It's not even a large department. It can't possibly cope, but it is not being run by managers, but politicians. And not just any politicians, Brexit politicians who think they can achieve the impossible by just clicking their fingers. Apparently, the official DEFRA response to this was to say, well, it's patently untrue that they can't handle their workload. Not just untrue, patently untrue, as if it's obvious. It's like, well, how is that? You have had their workload massively increased, but without extra resources. And I go back to that retained EU law bill. 40% of all the regulations and rules that are anticipated to be impacted are covered by DEFRA. So this department, which is not a massive government department, has 40% of all of the rules and regulations that the EU retained EU law bill will affect. So they've got to try and go through all of those. All extra work, no new staff to do it. How does anyone expect them to cope? And this will be happening in lots of government departments. They've all had an increased workload due to both Brexit and ridiculous post-Brexit policies, such as the retained EU law bill. But DEFRA has it particularly bad. And so the impact has been particularly noticeable to people who need to deal with that government department, because it's got by far and away the lion's share of the work to do with Brexit, on top of everything else, and with no extra staff or resourcing to do it. And various groups are now saying that they're just getting nowhere when contacting DEFRA, that there's all this complicated legislation to deal with to replace EU regulations, and it's not getting done. And when it comes out the other end, it'll be an absolute shambles because there's been no proper process to scrutinise it. Because that is an example of the way the EU reduced red tape. Brexiteers complain about the way some of the rules were decided collectively across Europe and how we should all do it ourselves. Oh, we should all decide everything ourselves. It's like, okay, there are very good reasons to have standardised regulations across our main market. But okay, you wanted to do it all on our own? Okay then. If you want to decide all these rules, we're going to need a much larger civil service to do it. We need way more staff because we've got now way more workload, but we haven't taken on the staff to manage it. So we're not deciding our own rules, because we might have ministers who make up policy decisions, although of much lower quality than used to be the case, but we don't have the officials to turn those brain farts into a functioning document. And a final thing to consider. At the last election, the reason Get Brexit Done worked so well as a slogan wasn't because it was a rallying call to those who wanted to Brexit. It was partly that. But it also worked on those who didn't. There was a widespread feeling that Brexit was consuming the attention of the government to the exclusion of all else. You know, the healthcare was failing, policing was failing, you know, schooling was failing. Everything was failing because the government were focusing on Brexit. Now, this was true and untrue. Yes, they were focusing on Brexit, yet that did reduce their bandwidth for dealing with other things. But the reason those things were failing is because the Tories wanted them to fail, right? But there was also a feeling that if we left the EU, then the government could move on and start paying attention to all the problems that were not being attended at the time. And this wasn't just a perception amongst the public. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives pushed this idea. Well, we're wrangling over Brexit. If you just let us get Brexit done, we can forget about it. It's in the past, done, and we can move on. We can focus on building these 40 hospitals, which we're not getting, on helping schools, you know, get the best education for your kids, which is still not happening. You know, or we can increase the number of police officers. We can do this, that, and the other, none of which has really happened. And that wasn't true, because not only are the Conservatives still arguing about how to actually deal with Brexit years later, they still can't themselves decide what they want to do with it. But the enormous extra workload for government departments, as a direct consequence of at least leaving the single market and customs union, means that we are incapable of focusing on these other issues unless we significantly increase the size of the state to meet the extra burden, the administrative burden, the extra workload. But Tories, and especially Brexit supporting Tories, are all about shrinking the state, not growing it. They don't like the big state, they want the small state. But it is not possible to have it both ways. So this is why we will continue to have a dysfunctional government until the Tories are removed from power. Because you either need someone who says we shouldn't have Brexit, or you need someone who says we need to increase the size of the state to cope with it. But the Tories will continually try and pursue mutually exclusive policies until they're kicked out. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.